This paper really began out of our personal interest and our own personal growth. We had been very focused on problems and sort of issues in our own family and focused on that. And over the years became more focused more on the person and how we can adapt and change. Well, what we did was change in sort of a bad way instead of a really good way, and that was trying to become more like what the other person wanted. And so we have gotten into this interest of family communication and family activity, which led us then to really doing some work in family communication.
Yeah. Actually, I think it was back in 2009. It was the first time that you came into my family communication class, and that was an undergraduate and graduate level course. And in that setting, we really had an opportunity to explore constellation theory. Hellinger, you had just been exposed to Hellinger's work, and you came in and actually did a constellation for the class. And I think from that point, you and I both got very excited about who is this Hellinger and why have we not heard about him? And we realized that Hellinger's focus was very different than any focus that we'd ever used. It really didn't have a problem orientation. It saw every person in the family system, as integral to the functioning of the family. So instead of seeing abuse or alcoholism or problems as problems, they simply were. They were simply parts of each person. And so we started looking at ways of seeing a family as a whole, complete entity, black and white, gray area, not good or bad or anything like that.
Yeah, it really morphed through a lot of different layers of things. So we began to write a paper about our experience in the family class, and that's really was the turning point in this particular project that we're talking about today. I had read on the outside, my love and history, I read a book about Thomas Jefferson's the women in his life, and as we began working on the paper from the family class, I just did sort of a little head slap. Oh my goodness gracious, this Martha Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's wife, really plays out all the things that we're talking about here. And so we decided that we then would work on a paper trying to explain the constellation process through this book by Virginia Scharf, The Women Jefferson Loved.
Yeah, that book was very powerful because as you were telling me about the book, what you said to me was, well, this is the women that Jefferson loved, and yet she's really nowhere in there. There was hardly any information about Martha. So before we get into what the paper was actually about, we probably need to talk a little bit about this concept of ancestral mind. And that sounds a little bit different to some of us, but the ancestral mind is really a concept that we find in a lot of different literature. We find in phenomenology, existential phenomenology, we find it in psychology. But if we were going to define ancestral mind, how would we do that, I guess?
Yeah, well, it's sort of, in a way it's kind of difficult, and in a way it's really easy. And really the ancestral mind is sort of the sum total of all of our ancestral experiences that we really contain today.
Right.
That we may think that we need to be 5'2" and this weight, but really it's some ancestral issues that are kind of coming together, maybe genetics in a way, but also just our belief system that sort of drives our behavior.
Right, so it's things that happen to our ancestors, oftentimes hidden or not talked about, secrets, behind the scenes, they can show up in later generations. And we know that. Other theories certainly talk about that. Systems theory talks about how it's very likely, in fact probable, that we're going to repeat patterns over and over. But this ancestral mind is really saying it's not just repeating patterns, but the ancestral mind is this sort of binding together of all of us to help protect the family.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the core purpose really of the ancestral mind, is to protect us as part of that family. And sometimes people will be rejected from the family if they don't
do what they need to.
If they put the family in some sort of danger.
Right.
Yes, exactly.
And so even as children, we learn about all sorts of behaviors, not on a conscious level, but on a subconscious level, that we might give up our individual physical integrity, and we might have abuse situations, have all sorts of violating situations, if we think, again, subconsciously, that that's a way of protecting. That's a way of saving our family or protecting our parents or something like that.
Yeah, and it makes a big circle back to really our sort of problem focus versus person focus.
Correct.
We were, as we mentioned before, really focused on problems, but this really brings it back to the person and what is the story that's being played out as we're exhibiting certain kinds of behaviors or reactions to others' behaviors. And that's really how this whole constellation process fits with all of these different pieces and parts that we've been talking about so far. Yeah.
You know, what was really funny, when we started writing this paper, Carol, you did, I think we were in your office, and you did a Google search on Thomas Jefferson.
Yes, absolutely.
And you found just a ridiculous amount of material on him. What was that?
It's like 8,000 books about Thomas Jefferson himself, and 11 books on Martha.
Right.
And then as I looked, how exciting, I can really learn a little bit more about her, and as I looked it up, it was really not Martha Jefferson, but her daughter who was named after her, Martha Jefferson Randolph. And this one book, Virginia Sharp, which I'd already read, was the only thing that really talked much about Martha at all. So she was really so much in the shadows, and he was
larger than life.
Yeah.
I mean, we've heard all the stories. There are so many stories about him. There are books about him. There are films about he and Sally Hemings.
Continually reinterpreting his politics and his
sure.
personal life. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So.
And so thousands and thousands, and possibly one book on Martha.
Yes.
So the other piece of that was that you found one image on Martha.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to put sort of a face to her because I really, as much as I had read a lot about Jefferson, I really didn't know what she looked like. And so I looked online. One image, one silhouette exists of her.
And it was on a website about Thomas Jefferson.
And the DNA investigation of whether actually Sally had fathered his children. Yeah. So then I got thinking a little bit about the Scharf text, and once again, there was no image of her in the whole book.
The only book about her.
Yeah, well,
but
partly about
sort of
her.
about her. Yeah.
And so, yes.
And so what we really did was, at that point, we went back into Scharf's book and we pulled out all of the issues, all the family patterns, and there was so many. There was invisibility, there was alcoholism and drinking issues, mental health issues. A number of the women died in childbirth. And of course, this doesn't even get into all of the entanglements and snares between African slaves and their white masters, and the childbirth out of wedlock and everything like this. Just all these kinds of issues were in the text. So we pulled all of these out and we created a sort of laundry list, I guess you'd say, and it had 24 or a dozen and a half of these problems.
Yes.
And then we stopped and we said, wow, that's a lot of problems. And we got stuck.
And we kept going back to the problems and thinking, well, there's got to be something there that we can sort of flesh out and talk about. And that didn't work. And we really got very, very frustrated, and we had to stop for a few days trying to really decide where we needed to go next. And with that stoppage, it finally allowed Martha to come through.
Yeah.
And we were...
The rest of Martha, not just the problems.
The day that we were really expressing our frustration, I was like, we have to finish this paper, but we don't know how to finish it. We just got called in a way to open up the book again, that the Scharf text that we've been working with. And we just opened up the book, and there was this lovely story about Martha. And we began to see her as a really vibrant woman,
fleshed
very
out,
different from the problem focus that we had on her for a long time.
So we turned to page 108, and it said, with another baby expected in the spring, Martha pursued her housekeeping. She saw to the hog slaughtering, borrowed 10 pounds of sugar from her mother-in-law, used the sugar to brew 15 gallons of beer. She churned butter, paid back those 10 pounds of Jane Jefferson's sugar. She played cards. She lost a shilling, and this pursuit was one that her husband was said to disapprove of. And it goes on, but all of a sudden, we stop seeing the problem focus of, oh, she was this, and this happened to her, and that happened to her. And all of a sudden, we saw this vibrant, living, breathing woman. She was a little bit of a scamp. She was a little bit of a tart. She brewed beer. In fact, the closer she got along in her pregnancy, she brewed more and more beer. She just thought, oh, I got to have a beer. And she just was lively. She was engaging. She gambled, and she was all of a sudden alive.
Exactly, flushed out, no longer the silhouette. We knew once we started that little process on that one page that we needed to keep looking, and we just kept opening the book, and there she was again, almost like we were being led to who we come to believe that Martha really is, was.
You know,
we feel like she's almost was there with us this whole time, guiding us along. And once we completed her list of her positive qualities, of her vibrant, lovely life that she was leading, everything just fell into place. It's absolutely perfect.
Yeah, it was. And the one thing that you kept reiterating was that Hellinger, in his work talking about constellation theory, over and over talks about how the soul reaches out and directs the movement, directs the change, really says there's more to this story. There's more here. There's more than just the problem.
Right, and so it brings us back, now that we've talked a lot about that, to really focus a little bit more on the constellation process, which is a big part of this whole story. And when Hellinger does constellation, if it's in person, he will ask who needs to talk to him, who's going to be the client, and they come and sit with him, maybe tell him a story that's just very brief, 2 or 3 sentences about a problem. That person is allowed then to pick family members out of the audience or in the seminar, and then they
position
themselves. Hellinger sets them up, literally standing up in the middle of the group. And then he just gets away and lets the whole process unfold. People will have things they need to say, they may move, they may reorient themselves to the client or to other people. And in maybe 10 minutes or 30 minutes, the whole story unfolds. And in many ways, that's what happened with us, was that we began to set up the constellation, and it was perfect. Despite our frustration, we just didn't let it all play out as we wanted it to.
As we wanted it to.
Yes, instead of as it should have.
So as soon as we stood back, Martha, the energy, the heart, the soul, that soul came to life, directed us, and all of a sudden we saw the living, breathing woman who has been in the shadows, who has been invisible for over 250 years. And that sense of woman, we really have a special place for her in our heart.
Yes.
Thank you, Martha.
Thank you, Martha.